Hello, and welcome to this Gartner webinar, AI FinOps, Quantify Cost, Risk, and Value. Gartner delivers actionable, objective business and technology insights, as well as practical tools that enable smarter decisions and stronger performance on an organization's mission-critical priorities. Gartner serves executives and their teams across every major function, geography, industry, and sector with 14,000 client enterprises in 90 countries and territories. Gartner offers access to our network of more than 2,500 experts who create these insights, worldwide destination conferences, and a robust peer community with more than 100,000 participants. This presentation will provide a sampling of Gartner insights. I'm Jillian Page, your moderator for this session. And before we get started, I have a few tips to help enhance your webinar experience. Around the video player, you'll find a variety of ways to interact with the session. We encourage you to participate by clicking the Ask the Speaker box to submit your questions and thoughts throughout this program. You can either submit a question anonymously, or if you choose, your name, title, and company can be visible along with your question. Navigate to the bottom of the page to download additional resources. Throughout the program, you can rate this session and share feedback on the insights provided. To submit your rating, locate the Rate Session link below the player. A box will open for you to select 1 to 5 hearts. Please note that 5 hearts is the top rating. Share your feedback on the insights provided in the Leave Further Feedback box and click Send. This webinar is being recorded. You can watch this presentation again and find more great insights on demand at gartner.com/IT webinars. Now I'd like to welcome Gartner Distinguished Vice President Analyst, Fran Karamuzis. Fran, thank you so much for joining us, and now I will turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Jillian, and I'm excited to be here with the whole group. This is a topic that's near and dear to my heart. I've actually been covering it for a number of years, years. So we are in this multi-year journey of artificial intelligence, and this particular topic, as we call it, FinOps, or I call it the AI, the economics of AI. It's really about quantifying cost, risk, and value, and on an ongoing basis, measuring it. One of the reasons that this topic continues to be top of mind and very compelling is when we do many different polls or talk to our clients, there's in the 60th percentile, 60 is when I ask people, how confident do you and your organization feel in quantifying and measuring your costs? It's actually quite low. Where over 63%, I believe it is, don't feel very confident in doing that. And then when we get to risk, the number gets a little bit slightly better, where it's in the 50th percentile. But then when we get to value, calculating and quantifying value, there we have over 75% of clients that are really, really struggling. And that becomes a problem because here we are in the midst of this AI journey, and many projects have been funded. And a couple of months later, the CFO asks, where I need to get on an earnings call. I need to talk about this. Can we calculate what the value is? And people are really struggling there. And therefore, those organizations that aren't able to do that, they're starting to hit sort of a brick wall where they might not get the next round of funding. And so this is now becoming a top of mind topic. So with that, I just gave you a little bit of data. I'm going to give you a little bit more, but I'm going to ask Jillian to put this URL link into the chat. If you type this into your browser, you can actually vote. You don't have to vote right now. If you want to focus on the slides and focus on the content, you can vote after the session. I'm going to leave it open for another 24 hours, so feel free to do that. But this is a really great way we can get a pulse of what's going on. So with that, let me jump in to share some data with you. So in 2025, and we try to keep the data really fresh because it's really the last 6 months that, gives us a really good indicator of what's going on. So this study has been done in the last couple of months. And what we asked is, what percentage of your enterprise AI investments are currently allocated to each of the following types of business cases? So in order to make it easy for people to understand, we sort of call them employee improvements, process improvements, and then business model improvements. And this is kind of how the respondents laid out. This is kind of their, if you will, sort of split or portfolio of some of their investments. So then, of course, we ask them the bigger question, which is, of all these investments, what's your track record for success? So if they scored a 4 or a 5 in terms of we got demonstrable ROI, that is what counted in these results. So 1 out of 3 scored this for employee improvements that they got demonstrable, ROI. 1 out of 5 in process improvements, and 1 out of 50 in transformational improvements. I'm not sure about you, but we think that that's not such a great track record. And on the bottom, all I did is I put those percentages from the last slide just here so you can see how people are spending their money. We actually think that as we go through, I'll talk about what we think are more optimal portfolios and what's really going on. But this track record really needs to improve. And that's what we're going to talk about today. How do you do that? We also asked more specifically in one of these CFO polls that we did with in one of these webinars, what are the benefits that you've seen predominantly? And 74% said we're saving time. Others said we're saving money, 5%. And then 6% is we got a revenue uplift. We're right in the process right now of doing a big study of where we actually downloaded the earnings calls of over 1,400 public companies to actually analyze who manifested this and felt confident enough to talk about what benefits they achieved in an earnings call. So if we now look at this in a different way, and the way we look at it at Gartner is how much of these things flow to your income statement. And what we've actually found is over and over again, as we're doing some of these work with our clients, is that time saved is not money saved. So productivity, those organizations, we talk to so many that constantly saying, I'm doing this for productivity improvement, I'm doing this, and they call me up. And when we're talking about measuring value, they ask me, how do I measure productivity? And we sort of talk about activity-based analysis, but we sort of tell them, do not focus on productivity per person. You want to focus on process and the marginal cost of the next transaction, and how do you actually reduce the cycle time of a process, the latency of a process, or increase the quality or the throughput or any of the elements across the process level instead of focusing on individual productivity. Productivity is interesting, and on a per person basis, it's can be very self gratifying for many organizations or many employees. However, it does not flow to an income statement, so it often doesn't become interesting to a CFO. And this is, many clients have used this term. Mike Ulster here who's the CIO of Mantech, actually allowed us to quote him. And what they call it in their organization is we have many examples of achieving blue money, meaning we've got productivity or we got some time savings, but green money, direct cost savings on our income statements or revenue uplift or revenue growth only come when we make critical business changes. Now, green money is a very U.S. centric term because our money in the United States is green. So I realize this might not apply to everyone, but the concept is what's really important. The other thing that people ask us is, can I reduce headcount, and what's going on with headcount? And we're about to release some research around that. But in this initial study, my colleague, Nate Suda, led this very important research. This got published about a week or two ago on Gartner.com. What he did is we downloaded all of the press releases in the last couple of months. So again, this is the 200 from January to June of 2025. And we saw all these press releases. And if you look on the far left, I know this is a busy slide, you'll see the number 241,454. That's the total headcount that was communicated on these press releases that were some type of layoff or some impact on headcount. But then when we traced them back and we really looked in more detail and read the earnings calls, read some of the financial statements, actually read in more detail what's going on in this press release, if you look, only 1% of the second item here is actually due to AI initiatives that were implemented. So I won't go through all of these, but we came up with these categories of restrain, reduce, reposition, things that were related to job creation. So we've done a fair amount of analysis on what's focused on all of this focus on headcount. And we found that right now, we don't see a lot of headcount reduction. We are coming up with our jobs research and going to talk a lot more about what's going on with jobs. But let me get back to the focus of this webinar, which is to quantify cost, risk, and value. So where do you start? Where we think people should start is by developing a common nomenclature within their organization. This is the nomenclature we've developed at Gartner. And the reason is AI, Gen AI, Agentic AI, they're not all the same, but within a category, a big spectrum of different things. And the spectrum, we range it from category 1 to category 5. Category 1 is everyday AI. Category 2 is embedded. And so I'll sort of show you what these things mean. Everyday AI are things like Copilot from Microsoft 365, coding assistants. There are these super ubiquitous things that are not necessarily, they're tools. They're not always full-blown solutions. And they're designed to really not for a specific persona that could be used by anybody in the company. So they're super ubiquitous and they don't have a specific focus. They can be used for a lot of different things. But because of that, we are not seeing any ROI from category 1. So we've done a lot of use cases and a lot of business cases. And that's because they're selectively saving you a little time here, a little time there. But again, time saved does not necessarily equal money saved. Category 2 is embedded, and that's an industry term. That's where the Gen AI or the AI is actually embedded inside some of these products, Salesforce, Workday, SAP, and many, many more. This is just an illustrative list. And then when you get to the third category, we track at Gartner. And if you're a Gartner client, you can click on this toolkit. There's over 1,000 different vendors. You can sort them by function like legal, HR, finance, CRM, supply chain, all of these areas. Or you can, sort them by industry and look at different solutions. And then we get to different builds, right? So what we've done is we've taken this spectrum and tried to separate it in, generally speaking, buy versus build. We all know that there isn't any pure buys. You definitely have to ingest data. You have to do a lot of different things, governance around any of these categories. So they're all a bit of a blend, but generally speaking, the 3 dark blue ones on the left are a buy, and the other one, the pink and the orange ones, are a build. And the reason we did it this way is because cost, risk, and complexity all go up as you go from left to right. The other thing that goes up is your capability of what you can do and the scale of what you can do. What doesn't necessarily track from left to right is value. If you don't do a really good job, you may or may not get value from any one of these categories. And we'll talk a little bit later about how you calculate value. But you need to establish this nomenclature. You need to establish this language so everybody's speaking the same thing. So someone doesn't just say, I want to do AI, and they use it as one big noun, because it helps you to now think through how you're going to start quantifying things and how you're going to start measuring things. This is the toolkit. I just put the slide in here so you could see if you want to download it from Gartner.com. Then you get to the next step. And now you need to take some of these categories and you really need to build a strategic portfolio. You need to take all those ideas and you need to sort them out and put them into a portfolio. The portfolio that we've created and we've established at Gartner, we call defend, extend, upend. Defend are those items, a lot of the ones in category 1 and some in category 2 that give you competitive parity. These are the ones that are going to give you some marginal gains, some micro innovations. They're often not going to give you ROI, but that doesn't mean you don't do them, because you still need to build digital dexterity. You still need to build what we call AI literacy. You still need to actually build a foundation. So you need to do some of this. We recommend, as you can see below there, somewhere between 5 and 15% of your budget. So just to use a median number there, 10%. Then the next category is extend. Those are the things that are going to give you competitive advantage. They're going to help you grow your market size, your reach, your revenue, your profitability. This is a very big category. And this is where you're going to get maybe 2 to 4 or 6x ROI on some of these initiatives. And then finally, we get to upend. Those are the game-changing ones that you might do, again, a small percentage of your portfolio. Now, this is just a rule of thumb. We see clients, mixing and matching their portfolio. Unfortunately, in the early days, what we saw clients do is what's in that first row here, which we call affectionately FOMO, which is the fear of missing out, where people wanted to do very conservative things. So they put a lot of their energy, time into the defend category. The problem is you're not getting ROI, and that's why we're seeing some of these stalled sort of initiatives going on and things not necessarily getting funded. Where we recommend, generally, if your focus is high ROI, and we do have public sector clients, so this might be a little bit different, you also might need to kind of mix and match your portfolio in the early days. But generally, something like 10-80-10 is what we recommend. But if you want to be a disruptor in your industry, you might disproportionately focus your portfolio maybe on that third category of upend. Really depends on what your AI ambitions are, what your profile for risk is. But this overall structure in terms of, building the portfolio, this isn't that different than classic strategic portfolio structures that you see from many CFOs. We've just applied it to AI to help you think about these models. So what's the starting point? You take all these great ideas. So you need to build a foundation of education. You see on the right there, education isn't training. Education is different, and it's actually a lot cheaper to educate people. But you want to create the art of the possible, get people build that AI literacy, that awareness, and that in turn breeds ideation. And ideation is not just once and done. We think people should be collecting ideas every month, every quarter. We realize you're not going to fund every idea, but the more ideas you collect, the more you have to pick from, and you can actually start to play off each other, where you can merge ideas, people can build off of their ideas. But you do need to explain to people that we do have a funding funnel, which is, and this is our biggest sort of source of advice here, which is you need to take all these ideas, you need to rigorously vet them, prioritize them, and then decide what you're going to fund. And when I say rigorously, I mean this is a repeatable methodology that you need to establish across your organization. And it involves establishing a litmus test for, once you prioritize them, what are you going to fund them? So you have 100 ideas. What are you going to be your criteria? And these are things you need to establish. Now, the organization sometimes does that together, the CIO, the CFO, and the leadership team. Sometimes it's the AI leader. Regardless, many of these things are so important. And you want to even make this somewhat public in the organization so people don't think they're submitting ideas and they're sort of languishing. You're really honing in what makes a good idea when you make this public. In addition, the other component of this is that some people say, well, we have different people in the organization who all are funding things. You can create multiple funding funnels where each team is using their own funnel and has their own subset of ideas. But what you want to consistently do is everybody has the same methodology for vetting them, prioritizing them, and then deciding what to fund. So I'm going to spend the next few slides talking about Gartner's approach and walking you through how we suggest you do that. We suggest you take all the ideas that need to be vetted and you put them on this axis, and the axis is feasibility and business value. So you need to calculate the feasibility and you need to calculate the business value. And what you're going to end up with is something like this, where you've taken all of your ideas, and once you've scored them on feasibility and you scored them on business value, you end up with something that looks like this. Now, when you get into the calculations, and we have a lot of research that's available on Gartner.com that shows you the mechanics of how you do this exact quantification. But the general gist of the calculation is, first of all, there's two different teams doing these calculations. The calculation for feasibility is really done by the digital team or the technology leaders. There are people from IT, from the CIO's organization, from data, from analytics. You need people from security to weigh in. You need people from enterprise risk, from finance, even from HR, because HR needs to tell you What's the feasibility of really shifting the people, the process around what's happening? And then you also need procurement, because they're going to tell you the pricing of some of these vendors. So you're going to take a lot of factors into consideration, and you're actually going to look at things like, what is the cost? What is the technical risk? And what's the time? What's the time horizon associated with this? And you're going to look at things like the technology itself, and whether or not the ecosystem of the vendors is really at the place where you want it to be. You're going to look at your technical debt. We have a whole series of variables in the calculation that you look at to come up with the score. And I'll ask Jillian to make sure that the slides are advancing correctly, because on my window on the left, they might not be advancing. So Jillian, if you would check that. The second component that you're looking at in this scoring section is the business value component. The business value component is actually calculated by the business leaders. And the reason it's calculated by the business leaders is because they have to own it. They're the ones who can really talk about, if we do this amount of scope and scale, this is going to be the value creation. And this is going to be the impact. And they're going to talk about the business risk. If you don't do that, what's going to happen is what we see quite often, which is a mistake, is we see the IT team, needing to go to a meeting, and they're the ones calculating the initial portfolio analysis, and they do a great job on the feasibility, and they say, yes, I can commit to delivering this in 6 months and all of that, and they feel very comfortable with that. But then they spend just 15 minutes and they go over to somebody on the business side and they say, hey, where would you score this, a high, medium, low? And then they go and present the slide. And then 6 months later or 3 months later, the CFO says, you presented this slide, and they're talking to the IT people. You told me that asset predictive maintenance and price optimization was, we were going to get a lot of value, and I don't see anything happening. And basically, the IT person says, well, I delivered it on time, on scope, and on budget, but I'm not really sure why we didn't get the value. Often you don't get the value because the business side didn't properly adopt the tool. They didn't change their process. They didn't change their metrics for their people. They didn't upskill or reskill their people. They didn't change their workflow. They didn't do a lot of things that they needed to do. They didn't embrace the real change that's happening in the organization. So that's why they need to, while the IT people are developing the solution, the business people need to be focusing on all of those things in order to ensure that you get the business value. And after you do a POC, after you do a pilot, you need to revisit these calculations to make sure they still hold true. Why? Because sometimes after the pilot or after the POC, you might scope things up, you might scope things down, and that changes the cost and that changes the value, and you need to adjust. So Jillian, if you would update the slides and move forward. What I've done here in the next 3 slides, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on them, is to showcase Gartner has about 45 or 50 of these assessments that we've done. We do them by industry and we've done them by function. Hopefully the one, if Jillian goes to the next slide, the one that you might be seeing on the screen right now is the one that is for product life cycle in manufacturing. And then there's one in design engineering in manufacturing. And then I've also put one in for manufacturing operations. So there's 3 different ones that I've shown here. As you can see, there's a lot of different use cases and business cases, and they score very differently in each of these scenarios. So now I'm coming back to the example to showcase to you that when each organization does this, it looks different. Let's say we were focusing on price optimization and we had 2 different companies, 2 competitors. In one scenario, the competitor might have one company have not been investing in their data for 10 years. So when they do their feasibility to get AI ready data, they need to spend $10 million, 10x more than their competitor. Let's say their competitor has been doing a moderate to good job of investing in their data. And when they do their feasibility and they look at whether they have AI ready data, they actually are only going to need to spend $1 million. So therefore, the feasibility score of that particular use case will be very different for the two different organizations, even though it's exact same use case. So when you download these things from Gartner.com, recognize that they are a median score that the analysts have put together from a preponderance of dozens, if not hundreds of clients, but that might not necessarily be your situation. This is all enterprise specific. So if we advance to the next slide, you can now sort these ideas and aggregate them in different ways. You can see how much you're spending by function. And so you can put dollar signs or euros or any of the different categories. And Jillian, if you would advance the slide, you can also start looking by group, and you can actually start saying for each group, what was their success rate? So what was the success rate of the CRM team last time they implemented something? What was the success rate of sales or customer service? And now what you're actually doing is you're using that for the next time you do feasibility and business value. So you're starting to accumulate your quantification. Other ways that you could aggregate these ideas is you could aggregate them by technology. And the reason I drew an arrow across these is because you sometimes want to say, well, let me group all the ideas that are using the same vendor, or let me group all the ideas that are using the same data, because by doing that, I might get better negotiation tactics, or I might be able to save money on using the data in multiple places and allocate the cost back to some of these groups. So you might not always pick every single category that's high feasibility and high value. You might actually pick some that are in the middle. Either way, the big goal in the end is what's on this slide here, where on the left side, I just want to make sure that everyone's seeing the correct slide, is you want to move from what we call disparate efforts to orchestrated efforts. You don't want all of this hodgepodge of things. You really want some really good orchestration. And as we move to agents and agentic AI, what's happening is when you start doing agentic, you'll see this becomes even more important. But even with AI and generative AI, what's actually happening is you need to have orchestrated efforts, because that matters a lot when it comes to cost and recognizing value. So now once we've done that, you need to keep going back to every single initiative, and you're going to do a more thorough sort of assessment of cost, risk, and value. You're going to be doing this multiple times. So as we look at every single idea, we have tools on Gartner.com. So we have, and I realize on the right side of this slide is a bit of an eyesore. This is a very detailed AI and Gen AI cost calculator. It's meant to not only give you the cost calculations for year one, but the recurring cost calculations over a 10-year period. It's also, if you look at the left side of the slide, trying to really maintain and make sure you comprehensively have covered every category. It isn't just what you're paying for a single vendor or a single tool. It's all the vendor tools are in that first yellow. All the infrastructure and operations, the compute, the cloud spending, the services, and you might be putting in your internal people. So the fully loaded salaries of your internal team, you might be paying a consulting firm, but you really want to look at all the steps and make sure you include that. You want to include all the elements that you're paying for data, the hygiene of the data, to the curation of the data, the storage of the data, all the different elements of making sure the data is accessible on a recurring basis, right, over time. You might be spending money on governance and security. Some people break out those two categories, so you can do that. The part that says human talent and process, some people sort of refer to that as change management. It's much more than that. It's what am I doing to upskill and reskill, not just the technology people, but upskill and reskill the people that do the work. And then what is it going to take the money that we're spending, the time, the energy to redefine the workflows, to redefine the operating model, to redefine the processes, to come up with new metrics for both the people and the process, because now some of the metrics are going to be done by the machine and what metrics around the machine, and some of them are going to be done metrics around the people. All of those things are going to change. All of that costs money. And then the last two categories are environmental, the ESG categories. So sometimes people want to do the offset costs for electricity and all these different things and look at their carbon footprint. And then finally, the risk management, which I purposely put in gray because you're actually now doing a risk assessment, and there's 12 categories of risk, of things like data risk, security risk, ethical risk, all of those different things that you would quantify and would add in and put into your cost calculator. This cost calculator gives you multiple scenarios that you can compare, and it gives you a 10-year bar chart. It gives you a cumulative cash flow. It gives you a per unit cost. And you could also put all the line items and categorize them by CapEx and OpEx so you can see the CapEx and OpEx costs. So that's if you notice the title of this slide is AI and Gen AI. We published this about a year and a half ago or 2 years ago, and we've kept it updated. However, what's not on here is agentic. We just came out with our agentic cost calculator just about a month ago, and that is also on Gartner.com, because what we found is you actually need a lot more variables or a different way to calculate agentic. So it's actually a much higher standard deviation. It's a bit more complex. And so we can actually walk you through that and on dedicated calls. Now we talked about cost, we talked a little bit about risk. Now I'm going to talk about value. When you talk about value, you need to separate out what you're measuring value on. So when we talk to a technology person, when they say, is this a great solution that we put in? They often talk about the metrics that are associated with the technology. How many people are clicking on it? How many people are adopting it? What's the performance of the tool? What's the accuracy of the tool? What's the functionality? Did we do it on time? Did we do it on budget? All of those things are important, but those do not translate to an income statement. When you get to business results, what you're trying to figure out is, did I impact the cost line or did I impact the revenue line? And so what we've done at Gartner is we've traced back and kind of given you a mapping of these things so that you could calculate value. And so what we did is if you see the dark blue in the middle here, we summarized all the major cost lines to these 9 categories. And then in order to make them easy to remember, we grouped them by what are you going to deliver, who's going to deliver it, and how are we going to deliver it. And when you do that, you end up with every one of these categories has metrics. And we've published those metrics. I'm going to show them to you in a minute. We did the same thing for revenue. So we broke down all the revenue lines and how do you get revenue uplift or revenue growth. And we broke that down into 9 categories. And this also grouped them by what is our product, how do we gain customers, and how do we sell them. You can change the groupings, you can change the names. The most important part is for you to associate the key metrics for revenue uplift and cost with your AI initiative. So how do you do that? Imagine, so I picked the revenue category, and if you look, I put all the 9 on the top of this slide, and on the far right, the one that says sales volume is the one I picked. So let's say someone comes to you with an idea and says, I'm going to increase sales volume, and what are the metrics that you need to consider? Now, the things on the right are what the technology people measure. The things on the left are what the CFO measures. So what you're really doing is saying, how is this AI solution going to impact one or more of these metrics? And is it a true cause and effect, not just a correlation? And by how much? And that's what you're going to use to actually calculate the value. And you need to do it for a certain amount of scope and a certain amount of scale to make sure that you're aligned to what you had in that feasibility and business value score on your chart. So we do have, if you look on the bottom of this very bottom slide, we have an entire publication that has every one of these categories, every one of these metrics, and of course, many, many examples of these calculations and how do you do them. So this one is the cost side of it, and I picked process improvement, and I sort of showcased all the metrics for that. And now here's of the publication, or one of the many publications we have, where we took 15 of the most common use cases that people ask us about: coding assistance, productivity assistance, marketing content creation. If you look right in the middle of the slide here, it says Gen AI assisted customer support. That's a big one. And then for that one, there's a buy and a build. And then for AI agents, we did that calculation. We did fine tuning for insurance underwriting and so on. So there's 15 here. If you download this piece of research, you'll actually see both the cost calculation in a spreadsheet with all of our assumptions and the value calculation. So I pulled one of them out, put it on a slide, and showed you kind of a synopsis, but in the spreadsheet, you'll see all of our assumptions, which vendors, how much pricing that we assumed for the different vendors. And we sort of said, here's the big three numbers that a CFO wants to see. They want to see what was the cost of the initial pilot, rollout, development, essentially to get it into production. In this particular case, this is a Gen AI assisted customer support. This is the buy calculation. And then the next number you see, or range of numbers, is what is going to be the recurring cost, and you'll see that's a per user cost. And then on the right-hand side is the value, and what we calculated as the value. So I put in some of the KPIs so you could see what we used. But on the lower left of this slide, it says for these assumptions, a build becomes more favorable after 500 users. And that's really seems like a small line, but it becomes very important. As you're doing your calculations, you want to see what happens when you change the number of users, when you change something about the data, when you change something about the particular metrics that you're focused on or the scope. And this is really what needs to be done as you move through your ideation, and then as you move through what you're going to fund. Now, you might not get very granular in the beginning, and then you keep updating as you're learning. You keep updating your calculations. Ultimately, everything comes back to revenue growth or cost avoidance. So we sort of summarized different things, and we went out and did some case studies. So here's a case study from Goldman Sachs, where they increased their test coverage of one of their applications from 36% to 72% in less than 24 hours. Those are 90% savings in time. However, there was like productivity leakage. And this is one of those examples where this was amazing when you look at it as a percentage or even whole numbers. But what you're really getting is you're getting some productivity benefit, and you don't get a big flow through or a big impact on your either cost line or your revenue line. So when you look at all these different case studies, and I believe all of these are published on Gartner.com, where you can read through what was the business problem, what did they actually do. We look at them differently in terms of, if you look from left to right, we got time savings. In the case of Pfizer, they got more throughput. In the case of Mitsui, I'll show you in a minute, they had 100 more new chemical compounds discovered. And I'll show you the impact in a minute because I pulled that case study out. Verizon, customer churn, and in the case of the last one is bad debt. So we kind of group them into these categories. And as you move from left to right, they get bigger and bigger in terms of value impact. But as you look at these case studies, if you now look at the Mitsui example, what you actually see, and I summarized it here, but in the write-up, it has all the detail. If I look at the costs on the lower part of this slide, they initially spent $20 million roughly on the building the AI solution. But when they were doing this and they went through the pilot, they went through the proof of concept, they realized that we need to actually spend $70 million on redoing our processes, our workflow, how we do compound discovery. So this is a chemical company, and one of their big areas is they discover new chemical compounds that they could sell. So if you see, they spent 3x more on all of that process change, on all of that change management, more than they did on the AI solution. So for a total of $90 million. But as they were doing this rigorously and figuring out their cost, their feasibility, and their business value, they realized, and when they put it into place, is they did discover 180 new compounds. On average, they were getting 1.5 million in revenue per compound. So as you could see, they had a 3x benefit. So this is the kind of thing that you need to do in order to figure out the cost. Now, what this slide does not show is over what time horizon. What this slide doesn't show is some of the recurring costs of, maintaining these AI solutions. So those are some of the things that you'll get, in the tools. But you need to ask yourself, when you're thinking about value and you're thinking about that calculation in value, and we call this slide our value axis or axis of value. There's that incremental on one end, that everyday AI that I talked about. On the other end is the game-changing AI. And as you get to different scenarios, what you actually see is productivity is really, really small. And it's in blue because some of these things don't flow to an income statement, as I said. Then you might get efficiency. Then you might get efficacy. Then you might get business agility, the ability to pivot when something changes in your business. And then you might get overall industry value that you're adding. So these are some of the questions that you're actually answering and doing when you're thinking about value in the qualitative sense. Then you're going to calculate the value in the quantitative sense. So what we talk about when we talk about this whole process at Gartner is that old process of design, build, run, that's gone. It's very sequential. And what people did when they talked about design, build, run is they built their business case ahead of time. And then they did a lot of analysis. They had a lot of discussions with management, and management finally approved it. And then management came back a couple of months later and said, did you get the value? They sort of checked in. So all the work was done in the middle. Unfortunately, with leadership, if you want to be a true AI leader that's really managing this well, you actually have to spend more time and energy at different gates or different points. So the slide starts in the middle where it says POV. That stands for proof of value. You're kind of doing these calculations that I just described when you're looking at that funding funnel. You're doing the initial calculation on feasibility and therefore figuring out the cost and the time horizon. And you're doing the initial business value calculation. Now you say, yeah, I'm going to fund this. So now you start doing a POC, a proof of concept. At the POC level, you learn a lot. And now you're revisiting your calculations. And you're now sort of saying, oh, now should I scope it up or scope it down? If I scope it up, it's going to cost more. If I scope it down, I might not get all the value. So you're adjusting those calculations. And then you do a pilot and you do the same thing. You adjust again based on what you learned. And at each point, the leader is saying it's a go, no go decision. Do I actually want to now cut this off because it's not going to work? Or do I want to continue? And if so, how do I manage the risk? And how do I move things from unmanageable risks to controllable and manageable risks? There's no such thing in AI as zero risk. And so you're trying to either fail cheaply or fail fast. So you're making those decisions in this early part of the POC and the pilot, and then you're actually executing. And the unfortunate thing of AI is once you've executed and you got the solution to work, you still don't know if it's going to fully work because you don't know if you have the data, the security, governance to make sure it scales. So you're actually going to do this task twice. You're actually going to iterate twice around when you do this. And so it looks like this where you're going around twice. So it is pretty iterative from that perspective. So your job as an AI leader, if you're on the business side, you're fundamentally responsible for value creation. And you need to drive those behavioral changes, those process changes, all of the workflow changes, the operating model changes. That's on you as a business leader, because you're the one that needs to understand and does understand and deals with customers, suppliers, and the constituency to drive competitive advantage. On the technology side, the digital leaders, they are responsible for the technology, the data, the software, the cyber safeguards. So fundamentally, they're managing the cost and by extension, the technical risks. So what it really looks like in this age of AI is that on the value side, you're really tasked with, there's a lot of pressure to truly delineate and expose all the factors that create an increased value. And that might sound like some simple words, but this is very, very hard. Many organizations, if you showed them 500 steps in a process, and you ask them, of all these 500 steps, which are commodity items and which are truly differentiating, they can probably name a few, but they sometimes struggle and say, well, it's the combination of this and this and this. And if you ask them, what key metrics do you look at? You start to see, can they explicitly explain, so that it can be coded or it can be turned into a solution? What are the factors of value? And then it becomes much, much easier to do all the calculations, but also to see how much change are we talking about? Are we talking about a little bit of process change or a medium amount or a large amount? And then on the technology side, we used to be able to see, thousands, if not millions of lines of code. But technology is actually becoming a lot more of a black box. So it's harder and harder to execute and manage risk. You can't, use a debugging tool or an audit trail tool and go right to that spot and say, this is what this is doing. And all of this is being impacted by even regulatory things. We had an entire webinar on AI sovereignty, on all of these things that, once you train a model, it's hard to actually untrain the model, if not impossible. So it's very unforgiving when you then need to actually go back and change this. So you need to do a phenomenal job. You need to be operationally excellent at all the things I'm talking about here around quantifying and measuring and essentially enforcing, if you will, or governing cost, risk, and value. So you're moving from a technology first concept of just using certain tools to thinking about it in a value-based mode and value creation and talking about capability first. So with that, I'll invite you one more time. And if Jillian could put the URL link one more time in the chat, you can now vote that you've heard all of these things. It's 8 short questions. And I will now turn it over to Jillian to take us through a few of the things while I take a look and read the questions that you submitted and answer some of them. Jillian?
Yep, absolutely. Thank you, Fran, for sharing those great insights. And as you mentioned, we do have time now to take some questions from the audience. Please continue to submit your questions and thoughts in the Ask the Speaker box. And remember to rate this session. To submit to know and do. Mission critical priority.
You to get it if you are a client on data governance they're using to enforce it, because it's different by country, has different implications. The next question is, have you any cost, risk, and value case studies in the higher ed industry? I believe we do, because we have an online interactive tool